Please be advised, this episode does have content that some may find distressing. As always, listener discretion is advised and it is not suitable for anyone under the age of 13.
Hello and welcome to episode 26 of It's Murder Up North. I hope you're all keeping safe and well. By the time this episode is released, I will have been back at work. I've tried to get ahead with my episodes to ensure that I can continue releasing a new episode each week. I love doing my podcast and the overwhelming support I have received makes me determined to keep going. As always, you can follow the show on Twitter at Murder Up North or Facebook at facebook.com/groups M Up North. If you love the podcast, please spread the word by leaving a 5-star review wherever you get your podcast fix. You can also support the show on Patreon and gain exclusive content including early access to future episodes. Just visit www.patreon.com/itsmurderupnorth and sign up today. Before I head to today's episode, it's time for my podcast of the week. Please join Dan and Elaine at Sublime True Crime. Here's a peek of what to expect.
I'm Dan.
I'm Elaine.
And we host the Sublime True Crime podcast. With a new episode every Sunday, we're possibly the only podcast where one of the co-hosts can't pronounce the name of their own show.
Oh, but you do try.
Yes, I wonder who that could be.
We concentrate on UK crimes of all kinds. Murder, rape, serial killers. We've even covered the world's largest mugging recently, although my favourite is still the Hatton Garden heist.
That was a really good episode, I really enjoyed that one. All of the crimes we cover are solved cases, barring the first episode where, in fairness, we were finding our feet.
Is that the one where you didn't realise it was unsolved until you'd written most of the episode and then didn't want to waste it?
Maybe?
We are currently completely ad-free, and we've just finished our first season. We'd love for you to come and listen to us.
Just search for Sublime True Crime on any good podcast provider, click subscribe and listen to the back catalogue of 15 existing episodes.
We hope you'll join us soon. Until then, goodbye.
Goodbye.
Now, let's head to the episode. Between the years of 2011 and 2012, there were approximately 53,700 reported sexual offences in England and Wales. Sadly, this is not an accurate figure, as many incidents go unreported. This can be for a number of reasons. The victim may feel embarrassed, scared, afraid of judgment, or believe that reporting it won't make a difference. There are many misconceptions around rape. One of the most common is that the offence often occurs at night and is perpetrated by a stranger. The truth is, roughly 90% of rapes are committed by someone known to the victim. Rapists can be friends, co-workers, neighbours, family members, partners or exes. However, today's case involves the 10%. Who were attacked by a stranger. In 2011, there were 553 homicides in the UK. 17 of these occurred in the city of Nottingham. The majority were committed by someone who was known to the victim, either a partner or a friend. However, there is one case that was not only brutal, but spread fear among the community, as the police came to the conclusion the perpetrator was not known to the victim, and an unidentified killer stalked the streets. 4 miles northwest of Nottingham city centre is Top Valley, a residential area which was constructed in the 1970s. It was here that 28-year-old, mother of 2, Caroline Coyne, lived with her long-term partner and their 2 sons. Caroline worked as a care assistant, a role she excelled in, due to her kind and compassionate nature. On Friday the 22nd of July 2011, Caroline finished work and headed home. That night she planned to attend a family birthday party at her mother's house and hurried home to get ready. She arrived home, put on a pair of pink and black trainers, some blue jeans and a pink FC UK t-shirt with the slogan "Want to Ride" printed across the front in black. Before she left for the party, she kissed her 2 sons goodnight and bid farewell to her partner, unaware that this would be the last time she would see them. The party was being held at her mother's house in Daybrook, just over a mile from where she lived. It was the typical house party, food, drinks and music, with an eclectic mix of guests. Caroline was enjoying herself, having a couple of drinks and chatting with her friends and family. She was described as, quote, the life and soul of the party, organising games for the guests. She was the worse for drink when she left. As the night wore on, Caroline decided to go to a local pub for a couple of drinks with a small group from the party. While there, she found herself caught up in an argument with a family member. To those who were present, they would later describe it as a minor disagreement that got out of hand. However, it caused Caroline to leave, followed by her half-sister to a local park. The pair sat on the swings and chatted. Caroline calmed down from the argument and began to mess around on the zip wire at the park, laughing and screaming with childish joy. Her glee was cut short when she lost her grip and fell from the zip wire seat. She struck her head on the floor and sat up, a little dazed but otherwise unharmed. Her half-sister checked Caroline was okay, tried to persuade her to come home with her, but the 28-year-old stubbornly refused, telling her sister she wanted to stay. Reluctantly, her sister left Caroline on the park and headed home. The following afternoon, a man entered the police station in Nottingham to report that his partner was missing. He explained that Caroline had been to a party the previous night. When she had not returned home, he thought maybe she'd stayed over at her mum's house. But upon calling her mother, he learned that Caroline had left the party and hadn't been seen since. He provided a detailed description of her, with auburn hair, wearing a pair of blue jeans, a pink top, and pink and black shoes. The officer taking the report paused and excused himself as he left the man alone. A short while later, the officer returned and sat in front of the man and informed him that the woman he had described had been found deceased that morning. However, they had been unable to identify the body. Now they had a name: Caroline Coyne. Caroline was found at 8:45 that morning, lying in a narrow passageway between 2 houses on Fornymount Road in the St Anne's area of Nottingham. Earlier that morning, one of the residents had heard a woman shouting, "Get off me!" The man told police he looked out the bedroom window. He did not see anything, so went back to bed. It was only when his wife left the house that Caroline's motionless body was found in the gap between there and their neighbour's house. She was lying in a pool of blood, curled up in the fetal position, her clothing disturbed and her breasts exposed. Police noted that the victim had a shoe missing, and with a lack of any identification, the only unique markings were 2 names tattooed on her body. The area was promptly sealed off. A fingertip search was started, while officers conducted door-to-door inquiries in the hopes of getting some leads. No one in the immediate vicinity recognised the description of the deceased. Fortunately, when Caroline's partner reported her missing, it gave police the first major break in the case, and explained why no one in the St Anne's area of Nottingham, where she was found, recognised her. Caroline lived in the Top Valley area of the city, which led police to question how had she ended up over 4 miles away from her home. Eager to apprehend Caroline's killer, the police made a public appeal. Detective Chief Inspector Tony Hayden said, quote, "Someone out there knows what happened to Caroline, and I hope that this incentive of a cash reward may encourage them to come forward. I would ask everyone to look again at the CCTV images we have already released of the man who was in the area at the time Caroline was killed. Ask yourself, did you know anyone who is likely to have been out in the early hours of Saturday morning, carrying a light-coloured bag on their back and wearing light-coloured or white footwear? Caroline was attacked and left to die alone in the street. She died a brutal death, and her family and friends deserve to know what happened to her." End quote. CCTV footage soon began to be submitted to the investigators, but the images provided a heartbreaking and sinister story. Police were able to trace the Mama 2's movements in the early hours of the 23rd of July. They determined that Caroline had walked from Daybrook, where the party had been held, and had been seen on Porchester Road on a bus's onboard camera. The image was haunting as a clearly distressed Caroline ran out into the middle of the road, waving her arms, forcing the bus to swerve to the opposite side of the road. Further down the same road, the 28-year-old is seen sprinting past a local business in the direction of Forney Mount Road, followed a few seconds later by a white man who was approximately 6 foot tall, dressed in black, carrying a grey and white bag. CCTV from a house opposite the business showed Caroline crossing the road. The man continued on the opposite side, but is clearly watching and following her. For investigators, these images were chilling as they watched the videos of Caroline, vulnerable and alone, being stalked by a man who was in all likelihood her killer. Numerous motorists also came forward to report seeing the mother of two being followed by a man on Porchester Road. To these witnesses at the time, passing the pair at 30 miles per hour, it is unlikely that they would have thought anything of the sighting until after they learned of the horrific crime that had occurred. A still image of the suspect was released to the public in the hope that someone would come forward and identify him. While waiting for more leads, police uncovered more CCTV footage of the attacker. They were able to ascertain that he had come from the Motley Top area of the city and had walked down Woodborough Road and turned right onto Porchester Road. He was later captured on CCTV running in the opposite direction of the crime scene. The post-mortem results were released to the investigators. It revealed that Caroline had suffered blunt force trauma, inflicted by a heavy object, believed to be a blood-stained concrete block that was found at the crime scene. Caroline had bruises on her knuckles, indicating she had fought her attacker, who had violently restrained her by the wrists, inflicting deep bruising where he had held her tightly. She also had injuries to her vaginal area, which were consistent with sexual assault. No DNA evidence was recovered from Caroline's body. However, the police believed this was partly due to the perpetrator wearing gloves during the attack. The pathologist also noted that the 28-year-old had been strangled. Due to the vicious nature of the attack, investigators were naturally eager to apprehend the killer before he struck again. However, exactly a month after Caroline's murder, the police received a call from a teacher called Jessica Price. And the 21-year-old had an incredible story to tell. Jessica had just returned from travelling abroad and had arranged to meet up with her friends in Nottingham city centre. On the 23rd of August, she had been shopping and went on a night out with friends. She lost contact with them and had to walk home as she had no money for a bus or taxi. In an interview with The Telegraph, Jessica spoke about what happened to her on that night. The following is her recollection of the events as reported in the Telegraph. Jessica stated, quote, "The time flew, and before I knew it, it was 3 a.m. My friends headed off in a different direction, and I decided to walk home alone." Jessica lived roughly 40 minutes away from the city centre. However, the route was down a busy main road. She continued to describe what happened next. Quote, "I didn't think it through much, but I thought it would be fine. I wasn't drunk, and I knew exactly where I was going." She proceeded to tell them she was listening to music while walking down the deserted road, when she spotted a figure behind her. Glancing over her shoulder, she noticed the stranger was catching up with her. She said, quote, "When I noticed he was getting closer, then I heard his footsteps. I decided I would turn around and ask for the time. That way, if he was planning anything, it might throw him off." She described how when she turned around, the man's face was covered by a hood. She recalls thanking him for telling her the time, before resuming her walk home. Almost as soon as she turned away from him, the man grabbed her from behind. He dragged her across the road and down an alleyway until they got to the steps of a local college. The attacker attempted to strangle her, pressing his hands tightly around her neck. Jessica resumed, quote, "I couldn't breathe at all. I was terrified. I struggled, but as hard as I tried, I couldn't pull his hands away. He was too strong. With the little breath I had left inside me, I managed to say, 'Please,' but he kept on telling me to shut up. I thought that was it. No one could see me. I didn't know what was going to happen next. I just thought I was going to die." Her attacker had pushed her to the floor, and as she tried desperately to pull his hands away, she was able to tell the man that she couldn't breathe. Surprisingly, the man released his grip, and she managed to persuade him to sit next to her on the steps. Jessica proceeded with her story, quote, "In that situation, I always thought that I would be really nice and really calm. If I could get the person on my side, then they might reconsider, so that was my plan. When he took his hands off me, I stayed quiet. Catching my breath, I managed to tell him I wouldn't make a sound, and he took a step back. That's when I knew my plan was working. I told him he could take whatever he wanted. I didn't have any money, but I offered him my iPod. He said to me, 'Do I look like I need money?' He had this arrogant swagger about him. He told me he didn't know what he wanted. I don't usually smoke, but when he lit a cigarette, I asked for a drag. If only so he could see I had something in common with him. I said, 'You should have just said something to me if you wanted to talk.' His whole attitude began to change as he started chatting to me. He even ran out to snatch my bag back from the street." She went on to describe how he handed her bag back to her, and they continued to talk, quote, "I was asking where he had been in town, anything like that. Just something to keep him occupied. I needed to convince him everything was fine. There was no way I could have run. He was blocking my exit, and I'm not fast at the best of times. He even apologized for scaring me. How many attackers sit down and apologize for attacking you? After a while, I just said to him, 'Look, you're heading in the same direction as me. Let's walk together.' He clutched her hand as they started walking back up to the main road. As they walked, she was able to convince her assailant to remove his hood so they could have a proper conversation. It was a ruse to enable her to see his face clearly." Her story resumed, quote, "Anyone who saw us would have assumed we were a couple, but I was desperate to get away. I was still keeping him talking. I asked him how he made his money. He said, mostly naughty stuff. He was holding my hand and trying to kiss me. I'm sure he was convinced that he had pulled me. When he leaned in to kiss me, I pulled away, and he said, 'I thought you'd forgiven me.' I told him I needed to get home as my mum would be frantic. Then he said to me, At least feel what you're doing to me." And he shoved my hand down his trousers. I squirmed as he smiled. At last he needed to leave. We even exchanged numbers, so he didn't think anything was wrong, and I told him I'd see him around. Following her encounter, Jessica returned home and told her mum about the man. A look of horror dawned in her mother's eyes. She told her daughter about the murder of Caroline Coyne, which had occurred while Jessica was still overseas, and that the man she had met that night could be the perpetrator. Alarmed, Jessica reported the incident to the police, providing them with a description of her attacker, which matched the description of Caroline's killer, with one additional detail: he had a tattoo on his hand. She told police that they had walked along Carlton Road, so investigators approached any potential witnesses. They gathered CCTV footage and found video showing Jessica and her attacker, allowing them to confirm that it was the man they were looking for. Crawling through the CCTV images, police observed as several times the man attempted to inappropriately touch or kiss Jessica. They saw him trying to drag her into secluded, unlit areas. Yet amazingly, each time, she was able to convince him to stop and stay on the main road. One image captures the pair 5 minutes away from the college steps where he had attacked Jessica. He has hold of the 21-year-old by the hand and is trying to pull her towards the steps of an off-licence, which is set back off the road, and its entrance is partially shielded from view. Jessica can clearly be seen refusing to follow him, knowing exactly what he intended to do. The young woman was also able to lead them to another piece of vital evidence. Jessica remembered where her assailant had discarded the cigarette she had shared with him. This was retrieved and was sent for DNA analysis. Meanwhile, police received information regarding a potential suspect. He was 23-year-old Carl Powell, who lived in the Carlton area of Nottingham. On the 27th of August, police arrested Carl at his ex-girlfriend's house. He was brought to the station for questioning, as a search of the property he was staying in was started. Carl denied any involvement in the murder of Caroline Coyne, and denied sexually assaulting Jessica. When confronted with the CCTV images that showed him following Caroline, he changed his story, stating he was in the area but had nothing to do with her death. The search of his ex-girlfriend's house uncovered the clothing Carl had been wearing the night Caroline was murdered, including the distinctive black and white bag Carl had been carrying that night. He was also found to have been at the Sherwood pub on the night of the murder, which was roughly a mile from Porchester Road, where he was witnessed following Caroline. When investigators received the DNA results from the cigarette butt, it showed 2 distinct samples, one belonging to Jessica and the other contribution was a male, identified as Carl Powell. Over a year after Caroline Coyne's murder, the trial began at Nottingham Crown Court on the 2nd of October 2012. Much to the displeasure of the defence, the decision was made to combine Caroline's and Jessica's cases into one trial. The defence argued that this decision would have a negative influence on the jury. Standing in the dock before the presiding judge, Mr. Justice Flux, Powell was described by reporters as a man with a baby face. However, when he spoke, his arrogant personality shone through. The court heard how Caroline and Powell's paths crossed. The prosecution presented the scenario that Caroline, as described by her family being, quote, worse for drink, attempted to make her way home from the park in Daybrook. They theorised that she had gotten lost and ended up heading in the opposite direction to her home. She found herself walking down Breck Hill Road, where she tried to flag down a number of drivers who didn't stop. A taxi driver pulled up and Caroline climbed into the back seat. However, at that time of night, an upfront payment of the fare was required, a measure implemented to prevent fare dodgers. Caroline had no money with her, and unable to pay the fare, she left the taxi. The next part has caused the family of Caroline Coyne great distress. It was revealed that 2 police officers driving down Breck Hill Road spotted the mother of 2 walking alone. They pulled up alongside her, and she immediately climbed in the back seat. Caroline asked the officers to take her home, but they refused, advising her that, quote, they were not a taxi. They advised her where she could get a taxi from and pointed out a nearby bus stop, at which point Caroline left the car and the officers drove away. Special Constable Purnell testified at the trial. He stated that Caroline Coyne did not appear in a distressed or drunken state. He defended the "we are not a taxi" remark, saying it was just intended as a joke, to which Caroline did not take offence. Addressing the officers' conduct that night, Tony Hayden, Chief Inspector of Nottinghamshire Police, stated they did, quote, absolutely nothing wrong. The police service is not there to give people lifts home. That's not what we're about. But we are there to try and make people safe. If Caroline presented herself in any other way, if she was injured or incapable of looking after herself at that particular moment, those officers would have done something about it. They gave her the right advice and sent her on her way. Unfortunately, she came across Carl Powell. That's why Caroline Coyne is no longer with us. End quote. The footage from the bus that swerved to avoid Caroline as she rushed in front of it on Porchester Road was played to the court. Watching the footage, knowing that in that moment she was probably already in Carl Powell's sights, is haunting. The bus driver had to defend his actions that night. Firstly, the bus was not in service. It was being used to shuttle other drivers home. The driver also pointed out that he and other drivers regularly have intoxicated individuals who step out on them and try to flag them down, and so he thought no more of it. Prosecutor Stuart Rafferty QC described how Carl Powell was a sexual predator who had a, quote, customary habit of prowling the streets of Nottingham at night hunting for women. The prosecutor continued, quote, from the very start he was fully aware of Caroline Coyne. He was fully aware of her condition, being drunk and confused, and he had taken such an interest in her that he even then began to follow her. A camera on a bus recorded her standing in Porchester Road, trying to flag the bus down. She by then had become so desperate that she was stepping into the path of not a car, but a bus at close quarters. After showing the court the footage of Powell stalking Caroline further down Porchester Road, Rafferty presented to the jury that the reason, quote, Miss Coyne was running from Powell was because he must have done or said something, causing her to become even more distressed than she had been, and even more anxious to get away. The defence argued that Carl Powell had admitted he was in the area of Thornywood Mount. He had heard some unusual noises and had gone to investigate. When he looked into the passageway between the two houses, Powell claimed he saw Caroline lying there. He panicked and fled. The defence claimed this was why there was an absence of the defendant's DNA at the scene. They continued by claiming that Caroline had died from the injuries she had sustained after falling from the zip wire, using the fact she had headed in the opposite direction to her home as evidence that she was confused, possibly from a concussion. This theory was rejected by the prosecution, who claimed that Caroline's injuries were so severe that they would have either rendered her unconscious or would have killed her on the spot. They stated that there was no way someone with such severe injuries would be able to walk over 2 miles or be able to have a coherent conversation with a taxi driver and a couple of police officers. neither of whom noted that Caroline had any visible injuries, which was confirmed by the CCTV evidence. Jessica was called to the stand to testify. During the trial, she was given anonymity, which she later wavered in order to tell her story. The jury listened to her statement and was shown the images of the defendant attempting to lead her away from the main road. The jury heard that on the night Powell attacked Jessica, he was seen in Nottingham city centre, approaching numerous women, all of whom rejected his advances. In his defence, Carl Powell stated that he had met Jessica in the city that night and the pair had consensual sex, claiming that the 21-year-old was being untruthful. 3 weeks after the gruelling trial began, the jury returned, finding Carl Powell guilty of the murder of Caroline Coyne and guilty of the sexual assault of Jessica. Sentencing Carl Powell to life with a minimum term of 20 years, Mr. Justice Flux addressed the defendant, quote, "Only you know what happened in that dark alleyway, but it's clear that you cornered her and attacked her. You subjected Caroline to a savage attack, bludgeoning her over the head, causing injuries from which she would die alone and defenceless." I want to take a moment to state how incredibly brave Jessica was to come forward, not only to report her attack, to testify in court and subsequently waiver her anonymity in order to tell her story. There is still a stigma which is attached to victims of rape, in which they are not treated as the victim, they are judged, blamed and shamed. And this prevents so many from coming forward. I dread to think what would have happened if Jessica had remained silent. As stated previously, the family were deeply affected by the inaction of the police officers the night Caroline Coyne died. Speaking to the press, following the end of the trial, Jason Stansford, Caroline's stepfather, stood outside the courthouse and addressed the press, stating, quote, "The family hold Nottinghamshire Police responsible for putting her in the path of her murderer that night. The police could have used their powers to take Miss Coyne home. When she jumped into their car, she was clearly intoxicated and in need of assistance. Instead, they were dismissive of her, and in the words of the defence barrister, Mr. Smith, she was treated as an inconvenience. The two officers simply pointed her in the direction of home and watched her stagger off for a few seconds until she disappeared from view. It is the family's opinion that Caroline was failed by Nottinghamshire Police that night, who had the chance to ensure a vulnerable young woman, worse for the wear of drink, was taken to a place of safety. So the police, in our opinion, failed Caroline, and their advice to take a taxi put her right in the path of her murderer. His statement continued, at this time questioning the actions of the bus driver, quote, "The bus driver and a colleague who drove past Miss Coyne and swerved out of her way when she stepped into the road and tried to flag the vehicle down were also accountable. The bus was not in regular service. It was effectively a taxi for other bus drivers finishing their shifts and did not come off duty until 5 a.m. that day. I was always led to believe that bus drivers would give free passage to children and vulnerable adults if it was needed. Caroline flagged them down and was asking for help and was ignored. The bus driver, who was a passenger on that bus, reported during the trial, "They get drunk people a lot flagging them down, and it was normal." So too, it seems, was their callousness and disregard for public safety, whilst at the same time expecting their custom. I can understand the anger the family have to those who they feel let their daughter down that night, from the police who pledged to protect and serve, to the bus driver who continued past the mother of two. This is one of those tragic cases where there were so many opportunities for things to have been different, but sadly Caroline Coyne ended up encountering Carl Powell that night, and it is only in hindsight that we see things could have been so different. Ultimately, it was the actions of one man that ended Caroline's life. He stole a mother from her children, a girl from her family, and the life and soul of the party was silenced forever. Mandy Coyne, Caroline's mother, spoke about her daughter, quote, "Caroline was a beautiful little girl who grew into a strong-willed and determined young woman. She lived for her 2 sons and played a big part in our family life. Her murder has devastated everyone, and it has been so difficult for us all, and especially her boys, to understand where thy mummy isn't around. Cameron, who is now 9, keeps asking questions about what happened and who did this. While it doesn't change the fact she can't see them grow up, it would be slightly easier now to explain to him that the person who did this has been sent to prison. Caroline had an extremely loving nature. She is missed every day, and somehow we have to find a way of living without her." Thank you for joining me for episode 26 of It's Murder Up North. One thing I noticed in this case was that the killer struck on the same date each month, which makes me wonder if it had some significance to him. What do you think? Episode 27 will be available next week.
So in the meantime, keep an eye on those shadows.